All right, Rabosai, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. We'll begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning. Share to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Menachem Av, the Tilson and Wall families, sending their love from Eretz Yisrael and inviting us, Eretz Hashem, to come join them Bakarov. Our week of learning sponsors, Ingrid Fishman and Lynn Caesar, in memory of their mother, Charlotte Gevantman, Zichron Livracha, and sister Judith Gevantman, Zichron Livracha. On their yard sites, we open in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama Slav and Aliyah, and the family Zayin Chama. We dedicate our learning to the precious soldiers who have fallen in combat, Sergeant Omar Ginsberg and Yonatan Deutsch. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, their Neshama Slav and Aliyah, and their families Zayin Chama. And of course, as always, we dedicate our learning in the schos of our precious hostages. May HaKadosh Baruch Hu return them to their mishpachos b'shalom and b'karov, and in the schos of our precious soldiers, may HaKadosh Baruch Hu allow them to be successful b'chol ma'asei yedehem. But with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today, Baruch Hashem. Today's naf is Mem Ches, and we are picking up on Mem Zayin Amud Beis 47b. Let's actually pick up. We actually got really towards the end of the daf, but let's pick up 5 lines up from the bottom. Rav Huna, because this is really the beginning of the sugya. Again, I gave you a little bit of a teaser yesterday, but let's pick up with the first sugya today. Rav Huna, Talyua v'zavin zvine. If you go ahead, now literally Talyua v'zavin literally means you suspend a person, you hang a person, and you go ahead and you force them to sell, such a sale is considered to be a proper sale. Or in other words, what the Gemara is saying over here is that a sale under duress ultimately is considered to still be a halachically valid sale. You compel someone, again, with physical force, to be able to go ahead to sell something to you, even though it is clearly being initiated against their will. If at the end of the day they sell, it is a proper sale. The Gemara says, my taima, what's the reason? So again, this is fascinating. We saw this yesterday. Kol demazbin inish, because in general, when a person sells their stuff, generally, again, the halacha assumes whenever a person is selling their stuff, a person never wants to sell their property willingly. In other words, in general, when I have my property, I want to hold on to my stuff. The only reason I sell my property is because I am under some level of financial duress. So every sale, by definition, has an element of duress. So ilav da'anis lo hava masbin, va'afilu hachi zvine zvini. See, even though normally every single sale has an element of duress, I would never be selling my property if I wasn't compelled to do so. And yet, again, halacha l'maisa, that is still a proper sale. So therefore, again, even when you actively compel someone to sell, that is considered to be a proper sale as well. So I will say, this is a really interesting dynamic over here. So if you take a look at the Rashbam, take a look 4 lines up from the bottom. The chol demaz bin inish rov chafatzim v'klibeso v'taliso sha'adam mocher. When a person sells his stuff, just regular stuff, he says ilav da'anis v'dachik b'mos. If a person wasn't in need of money, lo havamazbin, a person wouldn't be going ahead and selling anyway. Va'afilu hachi have zvine zvine. And nevertheless, his sale is still a proper sale. Bal karcho afilu lo gamar umakni shlo nitna torah chiluk b'mekach umemkar bein dvar matzrichen lo umachron ledvar shein tzrichen. So this is really an interesting idea. The Gemara seems to feel that in general, every time a person sells something, there is some element of compulsion or some element of duress. A person would not sell their stuff unless they were under some level of financial duress. And yet, despite that inherent level of duress, which is present in every single transaction, the transaction is still valid. What do you see from there? That duress does not compulsion does not compromise the validity ultimately of a sale. Really fascinating idea. The Gemara says, one second. That's a far jump. So now, what we're saying is, since in general a person only sells their stuff because they're under duress, therefore, compulsion does not invalidate the sale. Therefore, we'll say that if I physically force Ruvain to sell something, it's a good sale. Tush Gemara says that is quite a jump. Vidilma, shiny onsa dinafshemi onsa dachrini. 1 second, but maybe one can make a difference between self-imposed duress or compulsion versus external duress or compulsion, right? In other words, okay, I feel under duress to sell my stuff, I'm still making my own decision. Versus when someone else compels me to do something, Perhaps that shouldn't be valid. Elikidisanya. So I'll say, here's what we're looking for. We're looking to find a source that external duress does not go ahead, or external compulsion does not undermine the effectiveness of a transaction. Elikidisanya. The Gemara says, I'll bring you another proof. Top of Memches 48a. This is quite interesting. Yakriv oso. So I'll say, so the pasuk says, now just to give you the whole pasuk, because actually to appreciate the Gemara's drasha, you have to understand the whole pasuk. The whole pasuk is, im ola karbano, if a person has to bring an arla, min abakar zocher tamim yakrivenu, you bring it from cows, from cattle, a male, tamim, unblemished, yakrivenu al pesach alma. You should offer it at the entrance of the Oamoid, Yakriv oso lirtzono lifnei Hashem. You will offer it in accordance with his will, or by his own will, before Hashem. Now I will say, that phrase, Yakriv oso, is extra. Is extra. The pasuk already says, Yakrivenu. Why do you need another Yakriv oso? Melamed shekolfin oso. So also, what does it teach me? It's fascinating halacha, that if I have an obligation to bring an olah, and I am not bringing it of my own volition, that I could be forced to bring my olah. Okay, so the Gemara says, here's the problem. So you might have thought that you would bring an olah even against your will. No. But the pasuk says the only can only be brought in accordance with your own will. In other words, an olah has to be voluntary. So let's see what's happening over here. So Yakriv also teaches me that I could be forced to bring an olah, but yet the pasuk says lirtzono has to be brought in with accordance with my own free will. So how do you satisfy both of those things? Hakesad kolfin oso ad sheyomar rotza ani. That we force a person, we compel a person until he says, "Fine, I want to do this. I want to do this." So I'll say, what does that show you? What does that show you? So means that a person could be compelled to a point that they want to voluntarily do something. Kolfinosa, we force him until he says he wants to. So you see from here that you could apply pressure upon someone to do something, but yet the act can still be considered to be occurring of their own volition. So therefore, coming full circle, we want to suggest the same way, if I force Ruvain to sell something, that could still be considered to be a willful sale on behalf of Ruvain. The Gemara says, 1 second. But maybe the carbon case is different. Why? Because at the end of the day, there is an inherent benefit for Ruvain bringing the carbon. What is that? Atonement. And of course, again, I will say in life, there is no greater bracha than atonement. So maybe that's where you could say Kofen Oser Hashim Rasani. But in a regular transactional situation, perhaps we do not apply this concept. Ve'ela miseifa. So I will say, so maybe let's look from the next case. V'chein ata omer begitei nashim. Okay, here's another case. A get, a divorce document. Well, we'll say, what happens by a divorce document? Kolfin oso achi yomar rotza ani. That halacha l'maisa, if a man is obligated to give his wife a get, look at the Rashbam. The Rashbam says over here, "V'chein ata on begitei nashim, b'hanach tisnan ve'ilu kolfin oso lahotzi muka shchin ubal polifus the kolfin umakin oso at shiyom rotzani to no sin midaito mashla." So we'll say the Rashbam over here is quoting the context that there are certain men who are obligated to go out and give their wife a get. Let's say the man has a physical condition that makes him physically repulsive. It would be unfair to ask a woman to stay in a marriage like that. So we force the husband to give his wife a get. So I'll say, let's say he doesn't want to. He has no interest in leaving this marriage. So the halacha is kofin osat shem rasa. We force him. We compel him until he says, "I want to." And I will say, now again, what does that show you? See, if you think about it, that phrase "kolfin oso ad sheyoma rotza ani" seems to be inherently contradictory, right? If it's kolfin oso, then what does that tell you? It's not rotza ani. Right? And if it's rotza ani, that it's not kolfin oso. So what's going on? So we'll say, you see from here that you could apply pressure to someone to do something. You could compel someone to do something. You could put someone under duress until they become compliant. And once they become compliant, we look at that as a willful transaction. So we've seen it now by get, we've seen it now by carbon, and the Gemara wants to suggest it should be the same thing in Mekachu Memkar, the same thing in regular transactional law. I forced Reuven to sell me a field. He, at the end of the day, complies. I pressured him. There might have even been physical coercion. Which the Gemara says, Vidoma, shani hasam the mitzvah lishmoa divrei chachamim. Maybe a get is different also. Why is a get different? Because in a get, there's, and I will say again in general, when we speak about that we're forcing a man to give a get, who's forcing a man to give a get? Who's doing that? Beis Din. So maybe by Beis Din it's different, because once Beis Din tells someone they're supposed to do something, then halacha l'maisa again, it's mitzvah l'shmoa divrei chachamim. There is a mitzvah to go to listen to the words of the chachamim, and therefore again it's of benefit to him. So they're both saying. So therefore, what's interesting is as follows. So we try to bring up a number of different ideas that point in the direction that compulsion, that even if you do something under duress or under compulsion, ultimately it can still be considered to be a willful transaction. So we have three proofs, or we try to prove this in three different ways. Number one, by proving that in general, every sale, every transaction has a certain level of duress or compulsion. A person would never sell their stuff unless they were under duress or being compelled to do so. So we discounted that by saying, but that's a self-imposed duress or compulsion. Fine. Carbon. If a person has an obligation to bring a carbon, we could force them to bring a carbon. That's different because there's kapara. So we assume a person wants the kapara. Get, you can force a man to give a get until he says rotza ani. That's different because there he's listening to the words of chachamim. So we'll say, so from where do we know that you could compel a person into willful submission, and that willful submission is considered to be compliance? Elasvarahu. So we'll say, so rather it's a svara. Agav onse gamar umakne. So I will say this is fascinating. The Gemara says it's a svara. What's the svara? The svara is that when a person sees that he's being compelled, ultimately again, he makes his peace with his newfound circumstances, and he wholly commits to the transaction. This is fascinating. Take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Ella, it's actually right across. Ella, Rav Huna misvara didei kamar. So also remember again, Rav Huna is the author of this phrase that says tal yuha v'zavin, right? That if you literally hang someone, you suspend someone, and you force them to sell, the sale is a good sale. So again, the Gemara suggests it's a svara. Look at the Rashbam. Rav Huna misvara didei kamar. Timitoch yisurim. Since Reuven is being compelled to sell his field, and literally again, I'm physically forcing him to do so. He's suffering, so to speak. Gamar belibo umakni. Ultimately, again, at some point, he just commits to the sale. Why? Listen to this. Hoil v'ikatarti. Number one, there are two things. Number one, yisurim. Number one, he's looking to alleviate his physical suffering, and number two, matan mo'os delo mafsid midi. He's getting money. In other words, we'll say, at the end of the day, this is important to understand. When I'm forcing him to sell, he is getting paid. Right, I am paying him for this. So the Gemara wants to suggest that the concept, that this Rav Huna's concept is based on a svara. What's the svara? That at the end of the day, a person doesn't want to suffer. So therefore he's going to put an end to his suffering. And therefore, he's getting money. You put those two things together, and what happens? We believe that at the end of the day, he commits to this wholeheartedly. So isn't this fascinating? So Rav Huna therefore says, Tal yuav v'zavin, I force Reuven to go ahead and sell a piece of land. Rav Huna says, at the end of the day, it's a good sale. Why? The Gemara says, Svarahu agav onse gamar umakni. It's logical. He wants to stop his suffering. He realizes he's also getting money. And therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, he commits to the transaction. Rav says it's also a profound yesod into human nature. Right? One of the most incredible things that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has given us the ability to do is pivot. right? How often in life we encounter circumstances that we did not choose, and circumstances that we maybe even never foresaw. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives us this incredible koach to say, okay, this is where I am, this is what I've got, pivot, and now figure out how to maximize that which is in front of me right now. So in other words, Ruvain's suffering, so he's like, I've got a choice. I could resist, but resistance is futile, right? I'm not going to be able to change these circumstances, so instead, let me accept, I'm getting the money, pivot, maximize the circumstances I have, and therefore, amazingly enough, the transaction works. Which is incredible. So therefore, I will say, what's interesting is, whereas we thought that this was a din in kolfin oso ad sheyoma rotsani, it's not. It's something a little bit different. It's just svara. When Reuven realizes that he doesn't really have a choice, what does he do? What does he do? He accepts. Understand that this is godless. How much effort and how much time do we spend in life resisting circumstances that we cannot change, but yet I continue to fight against it, instead of acceptance and pivot. Accept and pivot. That's the sort of life. The recipe to success in life: accept and pivot. So the Gemara says that's the svara of Rav Huna: accept and pivot. Right? Reuven's being forced. Okay, I got it. This is not what you wanted, but this is what it is. So accept these circumstances and pivot. Incredible. Okay, so we'll say, so that's how we're proving it. Let's go Bava. We'll come back afterwards. Another interesting idea. Most of Rav Yehuda. So Rav Yehuda raised the kasha. 1 second. So if that's the case that we have this svara of accept and pivot, agav onse gamar umakne. So what about the following case? Get hamuusa b'yisrael kasher uba'akum pasel. So let's listen to this. Get hamuusa. So what's get hamuusa? So what happens if we go ahead and we're forcing the husband to go ahead and give a get? Let's say we just mentioned this case before. So whatever the situation is, the husband has a physical condition which makes living with him impossible, or for some other reason, Beis Din is forcing him to give a get. So the Gemara makes an interesting distinction. Rav Yehuda said an interesting distinction. If Jews are compelling another Jew to give a get, then it's kosher. Uba'akum pasal. If non-Jews are compelling a Jew to give a get, then ultimately, again, that is going to be pasal. Now, again, we'll explain that in just a moment. Uba'akum choftin also va'omrim lo aseh ma she'Yisrael omer lecha. I'll say, but if you have an akum who is compelling a Jew, almost like by extension of the Beis Din. In other words, let's say the akum is beating up the husband, and he's saying, do what the Beis Din tells you to do, then that's kosher. Why? Because in that case, again, the akum is looked at as the long arm of the law of the Beis Din. Okay, v'amai. So the Gemara says, but I don't understand. Even if the akum compels him, why shouldn't the get be kosher? V'amai hasam nami nema agav onse gamar umegarish. I don't say. I will say. We just said before that the whole svara of Rav Huna is acceptance and pivot. So therefore, again, even if the akum is the one who is forcing the Jew, why wouldn't that be a kosher get? Let's just say that as a result, ultimately, again, as a result of the compulsion, the husband comes to accept that he needs to divorce his wife and gives the get. So the Gemara says, "Ha'itmar la'amar misharshia divar Torah afilu ba'akum kasher." Gemara says, you're right. The truth is, mid'araisa, even if it was a non-Jew, an akum, who was compelling the Jew to give a get, it works. It works. So we'll say, "Matam amru ba'akum pasul." So then, why did Chazal say that if it is the akum who is forcing you to give the get, that it's pasul? So this is really incredible. Kadei shelo tehei kol achas va'achas holeches v'tola atzmo biyad akum umafkas atzmo miyad baila. So I will say, because this would create a very dangerous precedent. In other words, if there was this concept, that essentially you could get an akum to go ahead and start beating up a Jewish husband to go ahead and get him to give a get, we are very concerned that this is a very easily exploitable situation. You could have a woman who, again, wants to get out of the marriage, which she's entitled to do, and a husband should never withhold a get as any kind of leverage over his wife. But this is unfortunately an exploitable situation where now you're bringing in foreign entities, so to speak, into the get process. So a woman could go ahead and decide to just get an akum, beat up her husband, and go ahead and get the get. get. In other words, what we do need the get process to happen within the confines of a framework of halacha. Because remember, again, I will say, getting are one of the most sensitive. There are two very sensitive areas in halacha. Well, there are all areas in halacha, very sensitive areas in halacha, but two acutely sensitive areas in halacha, which are gittin and gerus, right? Divorce and conversions, because divorce and conversions really hold the key to Jewish continuity, right? If a divorce is not done correctly, and then again a woman gets remarried, we enter into a very significant issue of mamzerus, right? You have conversion, and conversion is not handled correctly. Again, a significant issue of lineage. So the Gemara says like this: in reality, technically speaking, if an akum goes over and compels a Jewish man to give a get, it should work. Based on what we said, what's the whole logic? The whole logic, I will say, is acceptance, pivot. That when a person realizes that he doesn't really have a choice, again, he accepts his circumstances and then again rolls with those circumstances, pivots and goes with those circumstances. That's the logic. Therefore, husband is getting beat up by the akum. He realizes he really doesn't have a choice. So what does he do? He accepts the circumstances and divorces his wife and pivots. But the rabbi stepped in and said, no, we cannot accept a circumstance like that because that is going to be chaos. That is going to create halachic chaos. And therefore, again, Chazal said that if the compulsion is done by the akum, and the akum is acting on his own behalf, not acting, or on the wife's behalf, but not acting on the behalf of Beis Din, that is halachically problematic. Okay, incredible. So most of Rav Hamnuna, really a lot of really interesting cases over here. Most of Rav Hamnuna, lakach misikrikun, v'chazva lakach min balabayis, mikchobato. So as we mentioned this case, right? So what happens? You have the sikrikun. The sikrikun is the extortionist. So what happened? I buy. So we'll call him. So sikrikun went ahead and extorted land from Ruvain. We mentioned this case yesterday. I go and I bought the land from Sikrikon, and then I went back and I wanted to be a good guy because I recognized that the land was extorted from Ruvain. So what do I do? I went and I bought it from Ruvain also. So I bought it from the Sikrikon, and then after I bought it from the Sikrikon, I went ahead and I also purchased it from Ruvain. So the sale is not good. Now, again, what's the assumption over here? Why is the sale not good? We saw this yesterday. Why is the sale not good? Because the assumption is that Reuven doesn't really commit, right? Reuven was extorted. So because he was extorted, he never wanted to sell it to the extortionist to begin with. And now, even now when I go back to buy it from him, we still assume that he's not really accepting of these circumstances. Va'amai, hasim nami nema agav onse gamaro makne. But I will say, if Rav Huna is advancing this svara, and what's his svara? His svara is agav onse gamar umakne. That ultimately, again, when faced with unchangeable circumstances, I accept, and I pivot. If that's the case, then why don't we say that when Ruvain, the land is extorted from him, he recognizes he can't do anything to change. So I will say again, the godless of this svara is that when it's such a profound strength in human nature, that when I am faced with circumstances that I cannot change, you have two choices: resist futilely, right, or accept and pivot. So now we're saying that human nature, Chosh Baruch Hu gave us the koach to accept and pivot. So now, why don't we say that the land was extorted from Ruvain? He realizes he has no choice, so therefore what? He accepts and pivots. And therefore when I go back and I buy it from him afterwards, which is a nice thing to do, so why doesn't that work? To which the Gemara says, Ha'it Marala. So Jews already commented about this case. Amra lo shanu ela da amar lech chazek v'kani aval b'shtar kana. So we'll say we said about that. The truth is, when do we say that I don't acquire it from Ruvain? That's when Ruvain goes in and just says, fine, go and acquire it. But if there was a shtar, if Ruvain writes up a shtar with me, then I can acquire it. We saw this all yesterday. And according to Shmuel, it says, no, even with a shtar, it doesn't work, right? Remember again that Shmuel said, Michael Amemar, Mo the Shmuel Heicha Diyav Zuzi. Even Shmuel would agree that if I actually pay him, and Halacha L'maisa again he accepts the money, that he does comply. Reuven will agree to the sale. Rav Bibi, the Sayim Ba Mishmei Rav Nachman, Karka Elo Maos Yeshlo Michael Amemar. And according to Rav Bibi, who ended off the case, remember again, this was the case of the Gazlan, right? That although a Gazlan cannot acquire land, although a Gazlan can't acquire land, if the Gazlan did acquire the land, if the Gazlan paid for the land, as much as he doesn't acquire it, what do? We give him back his money. So according to the Gazlan who says, according to Rav Nachman who says, Karka Eila Ma'os Yeshlo, that a Gazlan doesn't get the Karka, but he does get his money back, Ma'ikal Meimar. Ultimately, again, why? What is there to say? There's a say that according to our logic that we're saying, right? Our whole chap that we're saying is that agav onse gamar umakne. Again, when you are faced with circumstances that you cannot change, human nature is Chosh Baruch Hu problem with the koach, accept and pivot. So in all of these cases over here, so let's say again, Gazlan steals land, and he paid for it in this case. He's a chamson, right? He went ahead and he pay for it. So we said the Gazlan doesn't get to keep the land, but he does get his money back. But why not? Why don't we say he gets to keep the land also? After all, again, we should say that when a person is faced with circumstances that he can't change, he accepts them and he pivots. To which the Gemara says, Michael Mimar, Rav Bibi Memrahu, Umemra Rafuna lo Sviralai. So let's say, first of all, because this Rav Bibi is quoting a statement or an Amaraic statement, a Memra, and Rav Huna doesn't accept it. So we'll say, so bottom line, what it comes down to over here is we seem to have a machlokes, right? Rav Huna is espousing this ideology, this svara of agav onse gamar umakne, that when a person is faced with circumstances that he cannot change, what does he do? He accepts them and he pivots. Therefore, based on this, Rav Huna wants to say that if I compel Ruvain to go ahead and sell something, the sale is a valid sale. The sale is a valid sale. Again, Rav Huna is not encouraging this, right? Rav Huna is not saying this is a good thing to do, a nice thing to do, an appropriate thing to do, but halacha l'maaseh works. Now we see about said that there are undercurrents. There are other people who don't agree with this concept. For example, Rav Bibi clearly doesn't agree with this concept, because Rav Bibi says, for example, if thief comes along and forces Ruvain to sell and even pays Ruvain for the property, then what's the halacha? Thief does not acquire title, but again, we'll give the thief back his money. Right? We won't penalize him, we'll give him back his money. But according to Rav Huna, that transaction should work. That transaction should work. So the point over here is you see that not everybody agrees with Rav Huna. So I'll say what I just want to point out to you is something very interesting is there are two kind of like sister concepts that are existing here side by side. There's Rav Huna's concept, or I should say, there's a general concept of kolfin oso ad sheyomer rotsa'ani. Now let's say that we force a person to do something until he says, okay, I want to. And then there's the svara of Rav Huna's agav onse gamar umakne, that when faced with unchangeable or unalterable circumstances, a person accepts and pivots. So they sound very similar, but they're different. Kolfin also achiyoma rotsani really is predicated almost on the idea of like, it's going to sound strange, but like zachan adam shlo b'fanav, that we're going to force you to do something until you say fine because it's good for you. It's good for you, right? For example, it's good for a man to give a get to his wife when the halacha says you have to give a get to your wife. He doesn't want to. It's good for you, Tatla. It's good for you, right? Right? Listen to the halacha. Do what's good for you. A person has an obligation to bring a carbon, but he's not bringing it. We're going to force him to do it until he does it. Why? It's good for you to have kapara. So in those cases, almost like kolfin oso achiyoma, the halacha understands there's a benefit for you to do this. You don't see the benefit? Okay, we're going to help you see the benefit in it, even by the use of physical force. That's different than Rav Huna's idea. Rav Huna's idea is that by definition, human nature is when you are faced with unalterable, unchangeable circumstances, we have the koach, and I will say this is the koach of resiliency. We have the koach to accept, okay, I didn't want this, I didn't plan for this, I never thought that this would be. Deep breath, I accept, pivot. Maybe it's good for me, maybe it's not good for me, is irrelevant. But when faced with the reality that I cannot change what is happening right now, I accept and I pivot and I lean into my new circumstances. Maybe they're beneficial, maybe they're not, but this is what I got. So again, they're sister concepts, but not really the same. So the Gemara goes weiter. So the Gemara says, how do we pass? Amar Rava, Hilchasa, Tal Yuha v'Zavin Zvine Zvine. So Rava says, that halacha l'maisa, again, if you compel someone to sell something, ultimately, again, as much as the sale is happening with compulsion, the sale is still a valid sale. V'lo amran ella amadeis b'sad stam. Now we're going to give a couple of qualifications to this halacha. So on one hand, Shmuel says, just to show what's happening over here, we've got Rava saying that the halacha follows Rav Huna, the svara agav onse gamar umakne, unalterable, unchangeable circumstances. I accept it, and I pivot and lean into this new reality. So now, but Rava is giving some qualifications. Qualification number one: v'lo amen ella b'sadeh stam, ava b'sadeh zu lo. So we'll say, so first of all, when does it apply? So listen to the following case. I come over to Ruvain. I say, Ruvain, you are selling me a field. That's the statement. You're selling me a field. I'm going to pay you, but you don't have a choice. You're selling me a field. Now I'll say, now in that case over here, if you notice, I'm not telling Ruvain which field. I'm just telling him a field. A field. So because in this case over here, Ruvain has the choice to choose which field he's selling me. Therefore, we assume that Ruvain accepts and leans in. But if I force Ruvain to sell a specific field, then halacha l'maisa, Rav Huna's logic doesn't apply. All right, that's qualification number one. Furthermore, ubisadazu namilo amran eladalo artzi zuzi, aval artzi zuzi lo. Furthermore, let's say even in a case where I do demand a specific field, in that case the only time that the sale doesn't work is when after I give Ruvain the money, he doesn't count the money. But if he were to count the money, the sale works. And I'll say, what's the chap over there? Because if I pay Ruvain for a field, and he doesn't count the money, right? His failure to count the money almost looks like what? He's objecting, right? If you don't count the money, that shows that he doesn't want it. But even if I compelled him to buy a specific field, and he counted the money afterwards, so that could be shown that he is in compliance with the sale, the fact that he counted the money. Furthermore, again, I will say, we're talking about a case where he didn't have the ability to somehow get out of it. But if he did have the ability somehow to wiggle out of this, but he failed to do so, ultimately, again, then even if I compelled him to sell a specific field, and even if he didn't count the money, the transaction will still be good. So I'll say, so these are all of Rava's qualifications to Rav Huna's ruling. Yet despite all of this, the Gemara says, V'hilchasa bekulu tahavu zvine v'afila b'sadazu. So I'll say, so interestingly enough, the Gemara actually rejects this. The Gemara says, no, we don't actually take into account any of these qualifications. Rather, they're going to both say, whether I demanded a stamp field or a specific field, Ruvain did count the money, he didn't count the money, he had a way to get out of it, didn't have a way to get out of it. At the end of the day, I will say, the Gemara is suggesting, now we'll see what the halacha l'maisa is, but the Gemara is suggesting that halacha l'maisa, we go ahead and we accept Rav Huna's logic, and therefore when I compel Ruvain to sell something, the sale stands. The sale stands. We reject, we don't even incorporate any of these qualifications. Why? Svara. What's the svara? Once again, when faced with circumstances that Ruvain cannot change, what does he do? He accepts it, leans into it, pivots, and therefore halacha l'maisa, the transaction is good. Now I will say, interestingly enough, this is actually a fascinating statement that's about to follow, which is at first glance going to sound even like a little bit shocking. The ha'isha kisada zu damya. The Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Marriage, right, is just like the case of sada zu, this field. Now, what does that mean? V'amra meimar talyua v'kadish kidusha of kiddushin. Now, let's say if you compel a woman, force a woman to marry you, ultimately, again, the marriage is a good marriage, which I will say sounds ridiculously shocking because, Hilchos Kiddushin 101 is that what does it require? das, right? Das. And das we normally assume means consent. Willful consent, right? Not compulsion. So again, hold on a little bit. We have to qualify what this means. But the Gemara wants to suggest, Tal you have a kaddish kiddush of kiddushin. If you look at the Rashbam says the ha'isha kishemachricha adam lekabel kiddush of this kaddish lo. That if a man forces a woman to accept kiddushin from him, the Gemara wants to suggest that halacha l'maisa it works. It works. Now, what would be the logic to say that forced kiddushin works? Take a look at the Rashbam one more. Tal you have a kaddish. Kibla kiddushin, kiddusha kiddushin. The dami lezvine shemuchrach atzma lazeh. So the Gemara wants to suggest, because to a certain degree, right, marriage is just like a sale, right? Marriage is just like a transaction. And based on what we said before, that halacha l'maisa, if I force Reuven to sell the field and he comes along and he says, okay, even though he's clearly being compelled, halacha l'maisa works. The Gemara wants to suggest marriage should work the same way. It's transactional as well. Again, not the most romantic version of marriage, but you understand, transactional as well, and therefore it should work. Now hold on, listen to this. Varmar Meimar, Tal Yuah v'Kaddish Kiddusha Kiddusha. Meimar actually said that if you compel a woman to accept Kesef Kiddushin, it works. So Mar Barav Ashi Amar Bi'isha Vaday Kiddushin Lo Havu. No, Mar Barav Ashi is absolutely not. That is, you have just made a huge jump that is not halachically appropriate. Certainly, I will say, when it comes to a woman, right, forced kiddushin absolutely will not work. Now, I will say, now here's what's interesting. Why doesn't it work? In other words, if we're accepting this svara, that at the end of the day, right, Rav Huna's svara, what's Rav Huna's svara? When faced with circumstances that you cannot change, what do? We accept, we lean into it, and we pivot. I don't know. So if a man goes ahead, somehow forces a woman to do kiddushin, right? Literally, again, threats. If you don't accept this kesef, whatever, there's going to be physical duress. So why doesn't it work? Why doesn't it work? So Rabbi Ashi says, listen to this, this is fascinating. Rabbi Ashi says, Bi'isha vaday kiddushin lo havu. Vaday kiddushin lo havu. Forced kiddushin absolutely will not work. Why? Hu asa shelo kehogen, lefichach asu imo shelo kehogen, vafkinu rabbanon likidushay minei. And I will say, this is absolutely fascinating. Mar Bar Vashi says, you know what? The truth is, technically, maybe it does work. But the halacha cannot tolerate a kiddushin like this. It's inappropriate. Now, both say, literally what it means is, who asa shloka hogan? This guy, this husband, this man, did something inappropriate by forcing a woman to go ahead and accept kiddushin. And therefore, what does the system do? The system responds in kind to him and ultimately goes ahead and prevents the kiddushin from taking effect. And I will say now what's the logic? Take a look at the Rashbam for just a moment. The Rashbam says, Ma Bravashi, Amar, B'mecher modina l'chad davu zvini zvini. So, in a case of a transaction, in a case of a sale, right, where you force someone to sell something, okay, we'll accept Rav Huna's logic. Aval gabe isha, takon rabbanan delo lehavi kiddusha, to also shloka hogan. When it comes to kiddushin, I will say the rabbis legislated that such a kiddushin, a forced kiddushin, will not work. Why? Well, very simply, because it's inappropriate. Shechricha lefichach nase imo shelo keogen shelo kedin de'af agav de min Torah lehavu kiddushin rabbanon akrinu ve'ifkiru osan va'asu osamos matana. So we'll say, so let's talk about this a little bit. Let's talk about this outside. There's a concept, right? When a couple gets married, what does a man say to his wife? What does the man say to the woman? Hari'at mikudesh asli beit havas zo kidas Moshe v'Yisrael. Kidas Moshe v'Yisrael. When we get married in accordance with the laws of Moshe and Yisrael. What does that mean? Kiddushin, it's very interesting. The concept of marriage is every marriage only works if the halacha kind of smiles upon it. If the halacha consents to this marriage, then the halacha works. Then marriage works. If the halacha doesn't consent to this marriage, then ultimately, again, the marriage does not work. And all of marriage is predicated on the halacha kind of giving its stempel, its seal of approval, to the point that the rabbis have the ability to do what's called hafka'as kiddushin, to undermine the validity of your marriage. right? That even if a man went ahead and technically went through the mechanistic details of establishing proper marriage, if the halacha doesn't like the marriage, the halacha, so to speak, pull the rug out from under that marriage and do what we call afkaz kiddushin, halachically undermine the marriage to the point that it is no longer valid. So we'll say, so now watch this. This is one of these fascinating situations. Technically speaking, if a man were to force a woman to accept kesef kiddushin, does it work? Does it work? Technically speaking, it should work. In other words, if you follow our train of thought, in other words, if we accept Rav Huna's idea, and Rav Huna's idea, again, the svara of Rav Huna, agav onse gamar umakne. Ultimately, again, that Allah l'maisa, faced with circumstances you can't change, we accept it, we pivot, we lean into it, and move forward. So technically speaking, using that same logic, the same way that it works by a sale, it should work by Kiddushin. But yet comes along the Gemara and says, but by Kiddushin, but Chazal. So again, technically speaking, the Kiddushin should work, but the halacha can't allow for such a Kiddushin to be valid. The concept that a man is going to force a woman to marry him, that is an untenable reality, and therefore what the halacha says is, even if you affect a Kiddushin like that, transactionally, technically it works. Chazal will say, we're going to undermine the fabric of that marriage and tell you that the marriage is not valid. And Chazal have the ability to say which marriages work, which marriages don't work. And therefore Chazal are going to say, such a marriage will not work. So the Gemara says, okay. Now we'll say, now, that's very nice that Chazal say the marriage doesn't work. How do Chazal say the marriage doesn't work? So the Gemara says, Amar Lei Ravina Ravashi, Teinach Tekadosh Bekaspa. So that works fine, right? Let's say again, Reuven gave Rachel money. So if Reuven gave Rachel money, right, and he said, Hare at Mikudeshes li b'ma'oz zu, become Mikudeshes to me with this money, and literally again, he forces her to take the money. So okay, so then we'll say, so what happens? How do Chazal undermine that marriage? So the Gemara says, they say, okay, you know what that money was? You know what it was? It was a gift. It was a matana. It was a matana, right? And therefore, again, what Chazal do is they just relabel the giving of that money. Reuven said, this is your kesef kiddushin, and he forced her to accept it. So the halach has the ability to relabel that money and call that money, that's a matana. Happy birthday, right? And by the way, not that, she could keep the money, right? So in other words, the kiddushin does not work, and Rachel gets to keep the money. That works fine with money. Kaddish bebiya ma'ikal meimar. So again, we go back to the first Mishnah on Kiddushin. There are different ways in which one could affect Kiddushin. One of the ways in which one could affect Kiddushin is with biyah, right? Physically, right, is with an act of biyah, one could go and affect Kiddushin. So here's what's interesting. When you give someone money, so because that is a technical legal transaction, so you could relabel that or repurpose that. So even though Reuven said this is kesef kiddushin, the halacha could say that's not kesef kiddushin, that's a matana. What do you do with an act of biyah? What do you do with an act of biyah? How exactly do you relabel that or repurpose that? To which the Gemara says it's simple. Amarle shavyor rabbanan lebilas abilasnus. We call it an act of immorality. We don't call it biyah l'shem kiddushin. Rather, we call it, again, biyah for immorality. Again, you're right. An act of biyah is act of biyah. But l'maisa, now what we'll call that ultimately is a biyas znus. Biyas znus. And therefore, l'maisa, it will not work. Okay, so the Gemara tells a story over here. The Gemara tells a story. Tabi talo lepapoi akinra v'zavin. All right, so this is an interesting case over here. So a lot of new players over here. So there's a guy named Tabi. That's his name. Rashi says Gavra al alamahovi. Tabi was a very powerful guy. So what Tabi did was he suspended Papi on a tree in order to get Papi to sell him his field. So Tabi wants to buy a field from Papi, or Papai, right? Papai, right? And what happens? Papai doesn't want to sell him. So what does Tabi do? Tabi suspends him on a tree. Right? He literally hangs him from the tree. And he says, you're going to sell me the field. Okay? So what happened? We'll say, so Chasam Rabba Baravchana Amoda V'ashkalasa. So we'll say, this is very interesting. So now, watch this. Before Papai sells Tabi the field, what did Papai do? He wrote a moda. We'll say, what's a moda? He wrote a document that said, I am selling this under duress. I'm selling this under duress. He gave the document to Rabbi Baruch Chana. So now there are two documents. There was the Moda'ah, which was like the objection document, I'm selling this under duress, and then there was a document of sale. So what happened? Rabbi Bar Chana signed on both of these documents. He signed on the Moda'ah, and he signed on, which is like the objection document, I'm selling this under duress, and he signed ultimately on the sale document as well. Amar Rav Huna, man dechasam amodah shaper chasam, or man dechasam ashkalasa shaper chasam. So Rav Huna said the truth is, he who signed on the modah did a good job, shkoyach, and he who signed on the sale document did a good job also. The Gemara says, what are you talking about? Manavshach, imodah lo ashkalasa, v'ashkalasa lo modah. I will say, those documents obviously cannot exist side by side, right? In other words, if there's a modah, then there's not a sale. And if there's a sale, there's not a modah. So what's going on over here? To which you responded, Haki Kamar, ilav modah man chasam ashkalasa shaper chasam. So also what it means, what he meant to say is like this: we're not for the modah, right? Then the one who signed on the sale document would have been a valid sale document, which is another way of saying, affirming who? Affirming Rav Huna's position. This is another case of a forced sale. So what the Gemara is suggesting over here is, now this case is different. Why is this case different? Because again, Papoi is putting out there in document form, I don't want to do this. So we'll say, okay, that changes the math on this. Now there's a document, there's a modah document that changes everything. But in the absence of the modah document, ultimately what? Such a transaction ultimately, again, would have been a valid transaction in accordance with the position ultimately of Rav Huna, to which the Gemara says Rav Huna l'tamei, because Rav Huna goes according to his reasoning. Dam Rav Huna talyua v'zabin zvine. That Allah chalamayis, if you force someone to sell, ultimately again their sale is a valid sale. So both say. So again, this case throws in an interesting wrinkle, because in this case, so again, remember, without the modah, so had Papoi not written that objection document, I'm saying it's under duress, then what? The sale document would have been 100% valid based on Rav Huna. Now that there's this objection document, so that changes things a little bit. So both say, so this seems to all point in the same direction, ultimately again, of Rav Huna's position, of the svara being again, Agav onsi gamar umakna. So we'll say, obviously we haven't reached the conclusion of this. We're going to stop over here in the Gemara. Just want to share with you just like a closing thought for the daf, and then we'll continue. So we'll say, so it's fascinating, right? We know if there's one thing that we've learned in our journey in Shas, is how the timing of any particular daf always somehow fits in so beautifully with everything that is happening around us. So this idea that we are learning this daf with these two principles on Erev Tisha B'Av, I think is incredibly profound, meaningful, and uplifting. Because also, if you think about it, as we go into Tisha B'Av, there are really two principles that are first and foremost on our mind. We come into Tisha B'Av and we think about 2,000 years of collective difficulty. Right? And collective difficulty is even like an understatement. We think about what our history has been and how much we have suffered and how much adversity we have faced as a nation, as a people, as individuals. And I will say, what is the strength of Klal Yisrael? How is it that after 2,000 years of overwhelming adversity and suffering, and again, we're living through now the latest chapter of Jewish suffering and adversity, over 300 days into our newest battle, into 300 days of still hostages, still karbanos. So we'll say, how do we survive? The answer is Rav Huna. The way Klal Yisrael survives, Rabbi say, is Agav Onsei Gamar Umakne. The strength of Klal Yisrael is that we are able to accept whatever comes our way, because we know that whatever comes our way is from the Ribono Shel Olam. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the master choreographer. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the one who pulls all of the strings. And therefore, as much as it hurts and as difficult as it is, whatever circumstances come my way, I see it like this. Agav Onsei. A lot of times, Ribono Shel Olam, this is not the life we would have chosen. This is not the path we would have chosen as a nation. This is not the path we would have chosen as individuals. But Ribono Shel Olam, if this is the path you choose for us, if these are the circumstances you visit upon us, Agav Onsei, Gamaro Makne. We accept it. We accept it. We never spend our collective energy lamenting what could have been, should have been, or might have been. Instead, what is the power of Klal Yisrael? We embrace what is, We accept it, lean into it, pivot, maximize. Acceptance, lean, pivot, maximize. Regardless of Klal Yisrael, I will say, if you want to know what the mantra of Klal Yisrael is, Agav onse gamar umakne. Whatever HaKadosh Baruch Hu you give us, we accept. We accept, and ultimately again, gamar, we accept it, even though it's an ones. I didn't choose this, umakne, I'll make it mine. I'll accept it, I'll pivot, I'll lean into it, and I'll maximize it. I will say that's one Karle, but what's the other piece for Erev Tisha B'Av? I will say, we have to always remember that these days are days of tshuva. Are days in which, again, Tisha B'Av is not just about mourning, but Tisha B'Av is the beginning of the Yamim Noraim. It's the beginning of this season of tshuva. And I will say, if we try hard enough, and we use this time to really lift ourselves up, and we use this time to be able to affect change within ourselves, within our lives, there's another concept. What's the other concept? Kofin oso ad sheyoma rotsa'ani. I will say the power of the Yid is so incredibly profound that we have the ability sometimes to kiviyachal force the hand of the Ribono Shalom. That if each of us do our part, and each of us use these days of tshuva to their fullest, and each of us use this time to be able to Emirat Hashem, really maximize what we could contribute as individuals and as a collective, then maybe we will be Zoch Emirat Hashem also, Kofin also, then maybe we could force the Ribono Shalom, Ad Shiyoma Rotsa'ani, until ultimately again he says, I'm willing and I'm ready to bring the Geula. The power of the Yid, the power of the Jew is absolutely immeasurable. And if we harness it, and if we begin to operate on all cylinders, and we be able to do, we each do our own personal avoda, then halavai we will be zochem Yirtzeh Hashem to force, if we have to force the Ribono Shel Olam to bring the Geula, to bring Mashiach, to bring Tchias HaMesim, to bring the third base HaMikdash. Halavai we should be zocha. Mihir Rabbi Amenu. Amen.